Sometimes it's an obscure pasuk in the Torah that shows us the depth of what every part of Torah has to teach. In this case, what it teaches us about weakening the impurities of this world in order to bring more kedusha into the world. The pasuk is towards the end of Parashas Matos. It's the last pasuk in our parasha, which says, "V'noivach holach vayilkoides Knos goymer," that there was a man called Noivach, and he went and conquered a place called Knos and its surrounds. And then it says, "Vayikra lo Noivach b'shmoi," he called the place Noivach, naming it after himself. Rashi says there's a grammatical anomaly about this pasuk. Vayikra lo Noivach, says Rashi, lo einoi mapik hey. According to grammar, it should have said lo with a dot in the hey, meaning he called the place, which is a feminine place, Noivach. The dot is missing. Rashi wants to know why. So Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan apparently explains, Rashi quotes, it's because the name didn't stick. Therefore the hey is a soft hey, not the harsh ha, the mapik hey. Now there, if you say the word la without the la, it actually sounds a little bit like the word loy, as if to say, Vayikra loy, it wasn't really called Noivach after him. So that's how Rashi quotes Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, and then he has a question, because there are two other places in Tanakh where you find the same thing, and he says, I'm not quite sure what to make of it. What would Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan explain with two other words in Tanakh that are similar? One is Vayomer lo Boaz, where the pasuk says that Boaz said to her Rus, and it doesn't say lo as it should. And the other one is Livnois lo Bayis, which is a very intriguing metaphoric pasuk in Zechariah that says to build for it a house, and we'll come back to see what exactly that's about. So that's Rashi's question. You've got other places where lo is written without the dot, and if it's supposed to be similar to loy, how would you explain those? So now, there's a few questions we have to analyze over here. Number one, Aleph, im svirele Rashi. If Rashi is effectively telling us, Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan that effectively what he's saying is Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan's explanation doesn't really fit with the pshat, because look, there are two other places where it doesn't work. You see, two other places with law without the mapik, and you can't explain them in a way that would suit the pshat. So then the obvious question is, why would Rashi have quoted Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan in the first place? Rashi is always looking to explain the simplest explanation of the pasuk. If he feels that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan's explanation is not so close to pshat, don't quote it at all. So Rashi could have said over here, as we find Rashi does in many places across Tanakh, he could just simply say, I don't know why this word is said in this particular way or what it means, which would imply not that Rashi doesn't understand the word, but that he doesn't understand the specific meaning of the word in pshat, which is what Rashi wants to explain. He could have done the same over here. Maybe there's a mystical explanation or a midrashic explanation, but according to pshat, I don't know how to explain why there's no dot in the hey according to pshat. Maybe there's explanations elsewhere. Because the reality is that very often what you quote from Gemaras or from Midrashim is not exactly aligned with Pshat. It's quite common for Rashi not to quote those explanations because his objective is to explain Pshat. So why, if Rashi feels that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan has left a big gaping question about how you explain the Pshat of this same style of word in other places in Tanakh, then don't quote him at all. Say, that's drash, it's not for my commentary, and I don't know how you explain this according to Pshat. Number two, base. A technical question. How come when Rashi quotes the two other places in Tanakh, first he quotes the one about Boaz, Ha'omer Berus, which is written in Megillas Rus, which is Bichsuvim, in the third section of Tanakh, and then only after that he quotes the other pasuk, Ha'omer B'Zechariah, which is in the prophecies of Zechariah, which is Benevim, in the second section of Tanakh. Why does Rashi quote them not in line with the order of how they appear in Tanakh? Where in Tanakh, of course, Nevi'im precedes Ksuvim. Third question, and this is not a question in isolation, it's such a question which is asked Kushyas HaRamban by the Ramban himself. But Medrash Rus, if you have a look at the Medrash on Rus, there Yeshnon Drashos, the Medrash Rus there explains Hein al Vayomer lo Boyaz. Firstly, the pasuk as it appears in Rus, why Vayomer lo Boyaz is without a dot in the hay. Vehein al livnois labayis, and it also explains an explanation why livnois labayis in Zechariah does not have a dot in the hay. But yachdim madrash al pasuk didan vayikol novach, as well as the one which relates to our parasha that he called the city Novach, where the Medrash says exactly what Rashi has quoted from Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, Shaloi omad lo oisei Hashem, that this name Novach didn't stick, it didn't last. So the Medrash on Rus gives reasons why the dot is missing in both of those other psukim. So if it's written in a Medrash, why would Rashi say, I don't know how Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan would explain these two psukim? Well, maybe he'd explain it as the Medrash does. What's the big question? Now, it'd be really far-fetched to say, well, maybe Rashi never saw that Medrash in Rus. Look at what the Ramban says in his great question. V'harei harav oitzar blum l'teira lahalochos ulahagodos v'ishtemit. He's perplexed. How could somebody who has such an encyclopedic knowledge of every area of Torah miss that Medrash that is kind of well known and say, I don't know how Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan is going to explain it. Now this question, is actually an even bigger question than it appears at first, because Ramban, as the Ramban says, Gambi Gemara b'Masechta Sanhedrin, look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Motzinu drash al law. There the Gemara also analyzes an explanation for the word law without the dot in the hay. De livnois lo bayis. Why in Zechariah the word law is without a hey, she'ena mapikei, v'sham, and there the Gemara goes into quite a bit of detail and explains shahakosef. It's a metaphoric pasuk in Zechariah, and the Gemara Sanhedrin explains what the metaphor is. Koi b'chanufa v'gasus haruach sheyordu lebavel. So if you look in the context of what Zechariah is describing over there, it's this metaphor of these two women who moved to this place, to this area, and then this individual built them a house. So it doesn't say them, it says two people moved, and one of them built a house. Says the Gemara, who are these two people? Chanufa, which is flattery, and Gasas Haruach, which is arrogance, and they both went to Bavel. Says the Gemara, the fact that it doesn't have a dot in the hay of livnois lo bayis, says the Gemara, that's to teach us shahayirida de gasus haruach lebavel, that when arrogance entered Bavel, lo hoisaboifen shel kivius, it did not remain there permanently. Ditchila lebavel nochis, because it taka originally settled in Bavel, but then subsequently it moved further afield and it landed up in a different civilization called Elam. Now that's very much like our explanation, how Rashi explains our pasuk. Noivach was not a permanent name. There the Gemara says that the Gasus Haruach, the arrogance of Bavel, was not a permanent state. It moved on. Rashi should be able to quote that. Now, if you have a look at what Rashi says over there in the Gemara, maybe that will solve for why he doesn't quote it, because Rashi, Bepirush al Hashas Nokat, Rashi's commentary on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, he says, Shaharaya milivnois labayis lezesh tarvu v'lahosam. Rashi actually says, how do we extrapolate out of those words to build for her a house? Teaches us that Gasus Haruach moved from Bavel and landed up in Elam. It's not because there's a missing dot in the hay, and but rather because there's a change from addressing a plural group at the beginning of the pasuk to la, addressing an individual later in the pasuk. In other words, what's Rashi saying there in his commentary on the Gemara? He says, because earlier on the pasuk in Zechariah says, V'nei shtayim noshim. There were two women. Again, the women are metaphoric to represent flattery and arrogance. And they came into this place, l'shoin rabim, so there it addresses them in the plural. So if it's a plural expression, it must relate to at least two things that came to Bavel, which is what the pasuk is talking about. What are those two things? The Gemara tells us, Chanufa v'gasus haruach, flattery and arrogance. Vekan ksiv livnais lo bias the shon yochid. And then the pasuk continues to address the singular, that they were going to build for her, for one individual, this house. So Rashi, in his interpretation of the Gemara, tells us harimizem mashma, that implies shekeshabol livnois bias likboya bebavel. When it came to building a house represents permanence. So what is going to be permanent in Bavel? Nish'ara rak chanufa lichuda. Only flattery would be permanently established in Bavel. Whereas arrogance moved afield and landed up in Elam. Okay, so maybe it's not such a question that Rashi on our pasuk would explain Noivach is not a permanent name because of the law, but perhaps he feels differently about his Livlois law bias because he learns it from the context of the pasuk rather than from the missing dot in the hay. Says the Rebbe, yet even if you were to argue that, Rashi would not have this big question, like he's surprised. I'm surprised, what would Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan explain about that pasuk? Whatever reason it is that Rashi, when he was explaining the Gemara, did not want to use law without the dot as the proof that arrogance moved on to Elam, that's Rashi's perspective. It's quite possible that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan would be happy to say that it's the missing dot in the hay. Why is Rashi saying, I don't know how he would explain it? It'd be fair to say, I wouldn't explain it that way. But what's Rashi's great surprise at how would he, Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, explain it? So we need to understand why is it that even though there are places that tell us very clearly why or how to explain the law without a dot in those other psukim, and at least one of them is pretty similar to ours, that it's not a permanent name, why is Rashi so absolutely sure that it makes no sense that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan would be able to apply the same explanation that he uses here to those psukim quoted there? Okay, so let's explain what's going on over here. One thing that the Rebbe has taught us multiple times is even on those occasions where Rashi will quote something from Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, from a Medrash, from a Gemara, in other words, from the part of Torah which is not Pshat, if Rashi does quote them, that means that they must in some way be quite close to the simplest understanding of the Psukim. Rashi, as the expression Rashi often uses is Agada. So Agada means that's from the world of Drash. Hamiyasheves divrei mikra, which comes to explain the words of the pasuk, davar davar al oifnav, in the simplest, clearest way possible. Whereas if there is an explanation from elsewhere in Torah that doesn't in any way fit with the pshat, Rashi is not going to quote them, which we actually mentioned earlier on already. So therefore, we can understand in our context, the fact that Rashi did quote somebody from the world of Drush, Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, Al Vayikra Noivach, to explain how Noivach's city was not a permanent name because of the missing dot in the hay. It must be because in this context, what Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan says is very close to the easiest, simple understanding of the pasuk. And then when Rashi continues to say, I'm really surprised how would Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan explain the other two places in Tanakh with the same grammatical anomaly. Rashi is not suggesting that there are no explanations at all anywhere in Torah for those words la without a dot in the hay. All Rashi is saying is you can't explain the missing dot in the hay of law in those psukim using the same approach that we're using in this pasuk, namely drash hakoriv lipshuto shel mikra. In those psukim, I'm not going to be able to find a way to darshan the pasuk that is close to pshat as I'm doing over here. Because yes, there are midrashim and there's a Gemara Sanhedrin that gives explanations for the word la in both of those psukim, but they're quite different to what the pshat would be. So they're great for a medrash, they're great for a Gemara. It's not what Rashi is going to use. As we'll explain later in the Sikha. So that would help us to understand Rashi, the precise choice of language that Rashi uses. He says, I'm surprised. How would he explain these psukim? He doesn't say, I have a difficulty, I have a kashya, I have a major issue with what he has said. Because the truth is, Rashi doesn't actually have anything to contradict with or to have a big issue with what Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan has explained. Certainly not in our pasuk. He's just expressing surprise. The surprise is, I wonder how he would explain the other two places in Tanakh aligned with Pshat. It's quite possible. Perhaps the way to explain the other two places in Tanakh where la is written without a dot in the hay will be using a completely different approach to what we're using here. For which reason those explanations may not suit the simplest understanding of the pasuk. Because we could say, as we've taught elsewhere, here we're talking about a pasuk in Chumash. There we're talking about psukim in Nevi'im and Ksuvim, and yeshnam kama v'chama psukim v'teva shebehechech lefarshim shaloi al pi pashtus. When you're dealing with Tanakh, with Nach, there are many psukim that simply can't be explained simply. You can't explain them according to Pshat. Which is different to Chumash, where you can always explain a pasuk according to Pshat, because the goal of Chumash is to be Pshat and then layers beyond that. Whereas Nach sometimes starts at a layer that is beyond the Pshat. So therefore Rashi Toma, so Rashi's wondering, Utmehani, Ma Yidroi Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. What kind of an explanation would Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan give al beis hatevos lo ha'acheros on the other two occasions where you have la without the dot, without the mapik hey? Ha'im yiyu elu drashes akrovos epshuto shel mikra. It's almost like Rashi's wondering, would he be able to come up with an explanation that is close to the pshat? Which would make them somewhat similar to the explanation on our pasuk here in Chumash that law implies it's not something of permanence. Or is it possible that all that Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan would be able to explain, like in the Medrash and the Gemara, the only way perhaps to explain the law in those psukim will have to exclude a pshat explanation, in which case it would not be similar at all to our case, our pasuk over here in Chumash. That's what's, so to speak, on Rashi's mind. Is it going to be possible to find an explanation for those two psukim that is similar to the pshat? Okay, so let's understand. So in order for us to understand what Rashi's big concern is over here, we have to understand, as Divrei Rashi, the language or the way that Rashi said it. What did Rashi say? He said, La einay mapik. In this pasuk, the word la is written without the dot in the hay, so it's not pronounced with that strength of a la, but rather la, a softer word, which you could darshan to explain that actually it sounds similar to the word loi, meaning what is stated is actually not what lands up happening, at least not in the long run. So bashkofa rishona, first glance at what Rashi is telling us, Nira shekavonas Rashi will imply that Rashi's intention is sheyesh likroes pasuk. Then when you actually read that pasuk, you should read it ki ilu nichtav loi noivach. Vayikra, he called it Loi Noivach, a name that did not last as Noivach. Which would mean that in the long term, the name of this city is not Noivach in the long term, because the name didn't stick, didn't take. That's how we would think Rashi is telling us to read the pasuk. So instead of reading it Vayikra Lo Noivach, he called it Noivach, Read it, Vayikra, he gave it a name. Loi Noivach, the name Noivach did not last. Now, if that is what Rashi is trying to say, that would be a big problem, because then Rashi would be telling us to interpret the pasuk in a way that is the exact opposite of what the pasuk is saying at face value. In other words, they would be saying that Rashi is teaching us an interpretation of the pasuk that goes directly against how he comes to teach psukim. Ani loy basi ela lipshutoi. He tells us clearly, my only job over here is to explain the pshat. So why on earth then would he be explaining something which is not only not the pshat, but is the opposite of the pshat? Because when you read the pasuk at face value, what does it mean? To show us or to teach us. The pshat is Noivach named this city after himself, i.e., the name of the city was Noivach. So what is Rashi telling us? Rashi is being very precise here and says, Shemashma medrashoi kemoi loi. That when you analyze this pasuk one notch deeper, it implies something like loi. Veloishen mashmoi loi mamish. He's not suggesting that the actual meaning of the word is loi. In other words, he's telling us that the fact there's no dot in the hey, and you don't say lo in the normal grammatical way, that alludes to the fact what's in the pasuk? Something which is softer than usual, weaker than usual. The Torah is alluding to the fact that what is being described over here is flimsy. Yes, Noivach called the city Noivach. Pshat, that's what happened. That's why the pasuk doesn't say the word loi, because he did call it Noivach. But the way he called it Noivach was quite flimsy and weak. Because the reality is the name did not stick, it did not last. So what's Rashi telling us? The pshat is true. He gave it this name. Beyond the pshat, one notch deeper, there's a medrash that is close to the pshat. The fact that the Torah does not use the normal grammar over here and does not put a mapik hey in the word law, that's so we'll recognize that there's something weak about what the Torah is telling us. He did give the name, but it's a weak name. Now that we know how Rashi is looking at the pasuk, read the pshat, accept the pshat, and then weaken the pshat by this hint of the missing mapik hey. You cannot use the same logic in the pasuk about Rus and Boaz. Why not? Because when Megillas Rus Shom, you got to look at the context over there, Megillas Rus. Boim divrei Rus leBoaz. What's happening over here is that Rus has addressed Boaz and said, Loi eya ka'achas shivchoseich. I'm not even worthy of being one of your maidservants. Eini chashuva ka'achas min hashvocha shelcha. I don't even deserve to be. I'm not even of the caliber of your maidservants. Kamaina al dvareha mamshich hakosov. It's in response to that statement where Rus is saying, I'm a nobody. Boaz says, Vayoim alo Boaz. To that Boaz says, no. When it's time for the meal, you come join me and you eat. In other words, he's emphasizing that she actually does have prestige. So now the Medrash says, if that's the case, why does the la leloi mapik hey? Why is there a missing dot, a missing mapik hey in la in that pasuk? Says the Medrash, Sheboaz hey shivla. That Boaz responded as follows: Chas v'sholem, ein at minhu amohis shvochos. He was saying, you're not one of the maidservants. She was saying, I'm not even one of the maidservants. And he was saying, you're not a maidservant. Elamin ha'imohos, sorry, but you're somebody of the caliber of the great matriarchs of Judaism. Vahainu, in other words, the Medrash is telling us, that when she said, when she said, I don't feel like I'm even like a maidservant of yours, Boaz said, no, don't think that way. The facts are not as you describe them. So there, the Medrash is saying an interpretation that is the opposite of Pshat. So that Medrash cannot in any way align with the Pshat. You can't do what Rashi is doing over here to say, well, actually the word is law, and it really was a name, but it's just weakened. Because over here, Boaz is making a strong statement, not a weak statement. You're not a maidservant. So therefore, this style of explaining that law means it's exactly what the pasuk says, just weaker. Well, in Boaz's case, it's not weaker. It's exactly what Boaz says, with a full force of saying, you're a great woman. And we can use a similar approach to explain the pasuk in Zechariah. Yes, it's true that the pasuk alludes to the fact that the arrogance that entered Bavel was temporary, so therefore it's weaker. Leloi kiyum, it was not something sustained in that environment, because as the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, it eventually migrated all the way to Elam. But what's the pshat of the pasuk? When the pasuk says to build for her a house, it's not talking about arrogance at all, because it's speaking about the one of the two elements that came to Babel that will remain permanently. We're now addressing that one, which is which is only about flattery. As we already saw, Rashi points out in his commentary on the Gemara. The fact that the pasuk switches to the singular and does not use a plural term to them as the pasuk had already been using prior to this, Muchach, that Rashi says, is clear evidence that the pasuk, when it's talking about building this house, is only addressing a house for one of the elements discussed. Chanufa lechuda, only flattery, because flattery did not migrate to Elam. But rather it remained a permanent feature of the Babylonian culture. If that's true, so it wouldn't be logical to say, now that we see the switch from plural to singular, that already excludes gasus aruach, and now we're only dealing with Chanufa, which is strong in Bavel. It wouldn't make any sense now to say the law without the mapikei means it's weak. That goes exactly against the pshat. So therefore, Rashi has this big question. The style of explaining that the word law should be read aligned with the pshat, and also a little bit weaker because it's missing a mapikei, only works in our pasuk and would make no sense according to pshat in the other two psukim. But it's not as straightforward as that, because the Fiadrash Medrash Rus. Let's have a look what the Medrash Rus says about the pasuk. Pasuk lifnois lo bayis, when it speaks about building the home in the singular for her. Meramez ala sheker deshinar Bavel. The Medrash says that's referring to what? What would be permanent in Bavel? Deceit, sheker, falsehood. Velo lelo mapikei melamed shein sheker teshua. And there the Medrash says, why is law written without a mapik hey? Because the nature of sheker is, it can't really be helped, meaning to say, as the expression goes, sheker in lo raglayim, doesn't last. So if you go with that Medrash, Rashi could have quoted that Medrash. It's actually quite similar to how Rashi explains our pasuk over here in Matos. That yes, there is falsehood that would be part and parcel of Babylonian culture forever, but it's always going to be weak. Why? Because falsehood can never endure. So it will be part of their culture, but by definition, it will never be lasting. Why doesn't Rashi quote that Medrash? And then not have to have this big tumei honey. I don't know how you're going to explain it. Well, at least I have one pasuk that I could explain along the same lines of how we've explained our pasuk. And that would actually fit just as well with the way Rashi explains the Gemara there in Sanhedrin, where he said, where he said the one thing that will be of permanence in Bavel is flattery. Well, flattery and falsehood are not contradictions. Because flattery is fundamentally false. Rashi actually explains, what does chanufa mean, flattery? That they display themselves, they portray themselves as if they're these amazing people who live beyond the requirement of the law. In the meantime, they're rogues. So the explanation for that is if it's true that every single time that the Torah, well, there's 3 times in total, that the Torah says la without the mapikei, it always means that whatever's being described is in a weakened state. And then in this case, we'd say chanufa v'sheker she'ein lo teshua, that in this pasuk livnoi lo bias, it's referring to either flattery or falsehood that are fundamentally weak because they don't last, because people eventually see through it. Misareres hakusha, that would raise another question. Why is that something that we would emphasize specifically with regards to flattery, and not something we'd say about arrogance? In fact, there's even a logical reason to say it would specifically refer to arrogance. You see, once you go down this route and you say there is a bad trait that became part of Babylonian society, but it's a weakened trait because the nature of falsehood / flattery is that it cannot endure. Well, if you're already going that way, say the gasus haruach, the arrogance that came into Babel, did come into Babel, just in a really weak state, so weak that it eventually moved on elsewhere. But the fact that the pasuk says la, which as Rashi has pointed out, is singular. That tells me we're only focused on one element that is described in this pasuk. That one element being chanufa, flattery, because that's the one element that remained part of the Babylonian culture. So muchach, that indicates us from Rashi's own interpretation of the Gemara in Sanhedrin. It's not teaching us over here in this particular context that there's a weakness to flattery or falsehood. We'll learn that elsewhere, but that's not what this pasuk is teaching us. Dafka, the pasuk over here is describing that which became permanently part of Bavel, i.e. flattery, unlike the arrogance which passed through and ended up in Elam. So now we get it. Al pikol and al muvan gamatam. So what do we get now? We understand that Rashi is looking for an explanation where the midrashic perspective will dovetail with the pshat, and we only find it in our case. He did give it a name, Noivach, but la, without the mapikei, tells me it's a weak name. That line of reasoning is not going to apply to the other 2 psukim. With that, we can understand the order in which Rashi quotes those 2 psukim. We can understand why Rashi first brought a proof or referenced the pasuk from Ksuvim, from Megillas Rus, before Zechariah, which is an unusual order. Because by pasuk Vayomer Boaz Meirus, when you look at the pasuk in Megillas Rus where Boaz addresses Rus, as we've already discussed, the midrashic perspective is in contrast to the pshat perspective. As we already said before, the midrash is that when Boaz said la, he was actually saying loi. It's not as you say. Don't demean yourself. You're a great person. So that's why Rashi first quotes, what's Rashi saying? Tmei hani, I don't know how you're going to explain it. So here's the first place that you definitely cannot explain it according to Pshat, because the Midrash is the opposite of Pshat. So that comes first. It is much more distant from the simplest explanation of the pasuk, if you're going to follow the Midrash, than the Midrashic or Gemara explanation on the other pasuk, which is a lot closer to Pshat. Because, as we have already said, law implies that something exists, but in a weakened or flimsy form. Which, okay, we have ways to explain it. Either it's because Gasus Aruach moved out, or because Chanufa itself is weak. And the Shakasha the first came in Sachina Akasim the Shen Rabbi the Shen Yochi. It's just that Rashi would not use that explanation because he's already learnt all of that information from the way the pasuk is structured, switching from the plural to the singular mid-sentence. So what's Rashi doing for us? He's saying, I don't see a way that you could explain these other psukim along the lines of how we've done so in this pasuk. But the issue is, the one in Rus is more glaring, so I mention it first, and the other one you could debate back and forth, and you've got to have a shtickle drosha to understand why I wouldn't use that pasuk, so I'll mention it next. Okay, it's all very interesting to us. Well, what does it teach us? So let's look at the rich insights of the wine of Torah that Rashi presents. In all three cases where the word law is written without the mapikei dot, the subject is about something which is, at some point in its history, not holy. In our parasha, it's clear. A city that belonged to the Amorim, so that's not a place of Kedusha, and was conquered then by a Jewish person. Boaz, who's Boaz speaking to? Rus, who came from Moav, which is a place of impurity. And the pasuk in Zechariah, Bavel is describing character traits of Bavel, which is also a place of impurity. So, because we're dealing with a subject which is a subject of Tumah, in each of those cases, the law is a weak word. The Ram is to insinuate that we should know as an axiom that the existence of anything which is contrary to holiness is a flimsy, weak existence. Because only Kedusha is real, and only Kedusha is permanent or eternal, actually. Whereas anything which is from the other side, the klippa reality, is not true, cannot last, and therefore must eventually dissipate. That's why Rashi says, that's why Rashi says, I'm surprised, how would you explain these other two psukim? Rashi says, in our pasuk, it makes perfect sense. We're talking about a man going into a city that is a city of impurity and conquering it. That's iskafia, where you overwhelm the negative with positive energy. But it's kedusha. You don't transform it to become holy. You capture it. So there, matim orem is the law, lo mapikei. There, the word law without the mapikei dot is perfect. It implies that it's still there, just weaker, but it hasn't been transformed. So the place is still a place of impurity. It's just under the control of a Jewish person, somebody who has Kedusha in their life, but it hasn't transformed into Kedusha. But in the other two psukim, both of those psukim describe a very different outcome, where something that was originally impure is totally transformed to purity, to holiness. The most obvious is Rusam Moavia, Nizgaira. She started off in Moav, but then she was Megair. And she then climbed to the highest levels of holiness, to the point that Boaz describes that she is like Sarifka Rachel. And likewise, when we talk about building the house in Bavel, Hasheker Shel Bavel, the so-called falsehood that we're describing over here about Bavel is not just the fact that the civilization of Bavel has this fundamental problem with integrity. Actually, in a more deep spiritual manner, the so-called falsehood of Bavel talks about the fact that when you learn Talmud Bavli, it's not immediately apparent what the truth is. You have to work through Shakla Vataria, all the back and forth and the argument and the questions and counter-questions, proofs and counter-proofs. As it says in Chassidus. That's where the Torah has gone through a process, even into the world of darkness, even into the world of falsehood. V'dafka al yedei, and specifically through b'mechashakim oishivani, as the pasuk says, that Hashem placed me in darkness, which is Zeh Talmud Shel Bavel. That is a reference to Talmud Bavli, where the experience is that you are in the dark when you're learning. Until you reach the point that you've clarified what the Gemara is saying, you're in the dark. Nifal livnois lo bayis. The pasuk alludes that out of the difficulties and challenges and darkness above it, we build a house, which is the highest expression and experience of Torah learning, the permanence of Torah, the integrity of Torah, the trustworthiness of Torah. In other words, in simple English, where do you get the most enduring Torah? Through the battle of learning Gemara. Because both psukim in Rus and in Zechariah are talking about a scenario where that which originally was something negative and impure had been completely transformed to become something which is holy, then it would make no logical sense to say that the word la without a dot implies weakness. Because whichever way you look at it, it wouldn't make sense. If you're trying to describe that the klippa is weak, it's not weak. It's completely eradicated. It no longer exists. And if you're saying law refers to the kedusha, then it dafka should have had the mapik hey, the highlight, the emphasis, toikef hochi godol, to emphasize how strong kedusha is. In fact, where do you see the ultimate power of kedusha? Dafka, in the transformation of darkness into light, of klippa into kedusha, which of course is what we hope to see and experience through the gula amitis v'ashlema yusuna or abom min achoshech that should happen take from miyad mamash.